without further ado, I'm going to be having a fireside chat with Jon Perry, who is a game designer who started out making freeware games in the 90s with Derek Yu under the label Black Eye Software, making games like Quibble Race, Diablo. Oh god, I should have practiced the names. Diabolica. Wait, I do know this. And the full length Metroidvania Eternal Daughter. After a decade long hiatus from games, Jon reemerged as a tabletop game designer, publishing titles like Air, Land, and Sea and Spots. And then in 2024, returned to video games with UFO 50, a collection of 50 video games across a wide variety of genres. Hello, Jon.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Did I miss anything? You want to add any introduction of who
No,
you are?
no, you hit the main points. I'm happy with that.
Cool. So yeah, we're going to do this fireside chat style. It's a little less formal than our like big talks, and it's just a chance to discuss, especially UFO 50. You know, we're fans of many of like most of the people who worked on that and many of the games in that collection. So yeah, like I said, people can submit questions, but we are also going to get into some discussion ourselves of some of the games. And I think I would actually, I'm going to start with the big one, I think, which is Mini and Max.
Oh, sure.
uh, which, for people who haven't played UFO 50, um, Mini and Max is an adventure platforming kind of game. You play as a girl named Minnie trapped in a closet with her dog Max, who learns to shrink down to a smaller size, transforming that tiny closet into a larger world with collectibles, items, NPCs, quests. It's like a whole open world game at that point, trying to escape the closet. And I think it's really creative, and it's one of the ones that has proc gen in a really specific way, since once you get to a small enough scale, the world is more procedural. And so I think that it's one of the ones that was a favorite in the collection for a lot of people. And so I'm really curious to start talking about that. And I think the first one is just like, what was your influence? This idea of like it's an open world game, but starting from this very small space is just such a neat idea. Like, where did that kernel come from?
So I actually didn't set out to make an open world game. It just wanted to be that and turned into that, like fairly early on in the process. But it didn't start there. I think I was playing with this idea of shrinking and what that could mean, and I realized like I wanted a game where you could shrink to multiple levels, and I realized very quickly that if you go too many levels deep, it very rapidly gets out of hand in terms of the amount of content that I would have to make to fill that space out. So I realized, okay, 3 is kind of the maximum, and also I need that top level, right, which in the game is the storage room that she gets locked in at the start of the story, to be as small as possible. It was sort of the only way the whole concept was going to work.
Hmm.
So that was almost out of necessity. And then from there, it was really the story that guided it. I was like, why is this person stuck in a closet? And I was thinking of, a lot of other stories that have this, somebody goes sort of from the world of the mundane into some strange alternate world, stuff like Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland or that movie The Labyrinth, which I was a huge fan of when I was a kid, things like that. And so I was sort of just queuing off of that. And then I think I thought in the beginning it might be a little more linear, a little more structured. And I just realized very quickly that this needed to be a very open game where I didn't really put a lot of, um, I didn't really restrict the player's movement at all. And so that's just kind of where it ended up.
Yeah, it's just really interesting, and that feels like it puts you in, one of the challenges when you're doing procedural stuff is like people can come across things in different order, and you don't know for sure what they'll see and when. And I think that that's an interesting element of it, and that it's cool. Obviously, the positioning of a lot of the set content. I think the whole thing it's using a seed, right, so that it is deterministic. Um,
That's right. Yeah, it has proc gen in it, but it's a locked seed
yeah.
so that and that's like so that if you want to talk about the game with your friends, right, you're like, oh, if you shrink on this like one corner of the bookshelf, there's a cool item here, and we wanted people to be able to share that information, um, and just to create the illusion of like this is a real world that persists.
Yeah. How did you then figure out the spacing? Like, I think it feels like there's this really thoughtful sense of place of like, if you're in the flower pot, it feels like a place. And if you're in the lamp, that feels like a place. And it's kind of intuitively correct in some of what you would expect to find. And they feel really interesting. So, what was that like making that mix of a level generator and then I believe because yeah, of the levels down, you've got some mix of when things get more procedural and when things are more hand placed and kind of both making something that could create enough content that it had that feeling of literally anywhere you are, you can go down, but also there's a breadth of notable things and things that feel sensible in context.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, so this game, identified pretty early on that sort of what you're touching on was the core experience, right? Was like that you could sort of go anywhere, stumble into any like random corner, just exploring blindly and actually find something, right? Like despite what you would think, there's actually something interesting there, and so I had to sort of like attack that from like two angles, right? And one was just a very classic, just sort of brute force, handcrafted content angle, which Paul and the team helped me a lot with because it was just a lot of stuff to make. And so I had these fairly flexible systems that I'd built for handling events and NPCs and stuff. But then also the proc gen side to just fill in all of these gaps, right? It would have been impossible to literally fill this whole space manually. But again, so that dictated so much of what the game needed to be. Like for example, the game has these upgrades in it, like your character has many upgrades, the kinds of things that you might see in like a Metroidvania game.
Mm-hmm.
But here they play a completely different role, right? Because we don't have that sort of lock and key thing that Metroidvania games have, or not so much. It's more just there because I needed stuff to give out. I needed, right? Because I want you to be able to shrink anywhere and find something. So I needed those, just a long list of rewards that I could give out in a procedural fashion to sort of make it feel like, and some of those rewards are smaller than a full item upgrade. Some of them are just a
Mm-hmm.
little NPC that tells you a bit of lore or something. But a lot of it was just making all of that stuff and planting it everywhere I possibly could. And then the goal of the game also ties into the openness because the goal of the game is really just to acquire what is the currency of this small universe, which is the shinies, the broken pieces of this mirror that your character shatters. And so that, winning the game doesn't mean doing something specific. It means getting a lot of this very fungible
Mm-hmm.
resource. And that means I thought of it a little bit like how in a lot of modern board games, you have these victory points. There's this
Right.
term in board games, point salad, for like these games where like everything you do gives you points. I kind of use the shinies like that, where it's like everywhere you explore, every cool thread that you follow up on, you get some shinies, and that allows you to make forward progress, even though I have no control over where the player is going to go in this game, right? It's totally up to them. I can only sort of nudge them here and there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's funny to me because I've worked on a lot of like AAA big team type projects doing ProcGen worlds and semi ProcGen, and always I've only ever experienced the version where the world gets big fast and then you can't come up with enough stuff to fill it out. It's never that there's like too much stuff and not enough space. It's always it's easy to make the world bigger and it's hard to find stuff to put in it. And so, yeah, I would think that having the shinies too is like you've got your backup option of if nothing else, everywhere you go, you could find some shinies, and that's always helpful in your goals.
Absolutely. And then, you have these sort of these funnels behind the scenes that are like making sure, that you'll get an NPC that tips you off to where a town is eventually, so that, even though I don't know where the player is necessarily at a given point in the game or the order they're going to play through things, I know they're going to eventually be sort of shunted towards certain paths where interesting stuff is.
Yeah, something else I found interesting about that level design, and I think that this came up in the discussion of this episode on Eggplant, the podcast, Secret Life of Games, which I recommend. It's a cool podcast, and they did a covering of all the games in UFO 50. And it was that it feels like in this game, and maybe I think designers were more sensitive to it, but you can kind of feel the difference between some of the hand authored areas and some of when you're in kind of procedural world. but that's okay. And if anything, it's like it is exciting as a player to know that there are these very bespoke, unique feeling things like an NPC or a little town in specific places, and that if you look enough, you will be able to find them, and you know when you found them versus when you're in more kind of filler area, which is interesting because I think a lot of the time designers we end up trying to make that as seamless as possible, and like there can be a goal of make sure players don't know the difference between handcrafted areas and more procedural areas. So I'm curious if that's something that you thought about, if you have feelings on when it's worth having that be a clear split versus trying to smooth them together.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So, I mean, just in the background, I'd say one of the things that helps a lot is that at this is the lowest level primarily we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
because all of the procedural generation happens.
Yeah.
There's the starting level where you're a normal sized human and locked in a storage closet. Then there's a level below that where you're the size of a bug, and that's all still handcrafted. Then there's a level below that where you're, the size of a virus or something even smaller, and that's where I really needed the procedural stuff to fill everything out. One of the things that really helps is that like at that kind of micro scale, you can kind of get away with things being pretty abstract because not only like are things like germs and viruses pretty weird and not like super well known to us anyways, unless that's what you study or something, but it's also, it's a fantasy game. So I have a lot of room there to like go in and out of different modes, whether it's like the handcrafted or the procedurally generated. But to like answer your question more directly, I think I was trying to make them more seamless at the beginning and it
Mm.
evolved and that ended up being a little bit limiting. And so it sort of evolved more to where it is now where, I'm not trying to hide it so much, right? If I had, it was, I think, making the handcrafted areas a little worse originally
Mm.
because I was restraining them too much to be like what was possible with the procedural generation, which, the benefit of the handcrafted stuff is you can do more. So I loosened up on that. I allowed like for more bespoke backgrounds and things. And also like when Eric did the score for this game, he actually calls out those special areas. So that's also
Mm.
signaling. I don't know if everyone picks up on that, but there's like a different music that usually plays when you enter an area that is handcrafted. And I think actually that is really key signposting because, otherwise you might wander into one of those areas, from one side of the screen, not think it's important and then
Mm.
leave before you get to the key part. So I do think those signals that you're in somewhere a little special helps.
Yeah, that's great. And I always love a game that's willing to use kind of multiple techniques in multiple problem spaces of like, yeah, there's the different levels of shrinking. And so there's different kind of experiences, different expectations, and so you can use slightly different techniques. I'm gonna grab one audience question about Mini and Max. What's the deal with the sentient shiny star in the bottom left?
Uh,
It's
I
almost a
mean,
narrative type question, or but
there's a lot of weird stuff happening in that room. I mean, I don't think it's any more or less weird than the other things. I think a lot of people are wondering if there's, what they should do with that
mm,
shiny. I don't know if I want to comment on that or not. So,
okay, that's valid. Leave it mysterious. Uh, One other thing I wanted to mention, so one thing I really loved hearing people talk about Mini and Max is the sense of surprise. And it's kind of, I'm giving a talk later about surprise and suspense. And so it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think that it's delightful the way that, especially there's that reveal of, it's already kind of delightful to go from, little girl size to bug size. Eventually being able to do it again and go down to microbe size is like a moment that a lot of people found really, really compelling. Even though, and I think that isn't there a fake out at some point where it's almost like you think that you could do it again, but no, like that's the furthest it goes. And what I find interesting developing games that have these kind of surprises and where part of the fun is wondering, ooh, what's going to be possible, is how do you keep that feeling going and not disappoint? It's easy to set up the expectation of, wow, there could be so much stuff in this game, and then, you hit the point where you can't shrink anymore, and maybe you feel like disappointed of it's gotten smaller. But I think that from the way people talk about Mini and Max, it mostly stays feeling like all kinds of things are possible, stays exciting. So I'm curious how you thought about some of those feelings of surprise and kind of sustained curiosity and how to make those payoffs keep feeling good throughout. the game experience.
So an interesting thing about that moment is that for a while, pretty long time, I think, in the game's development, you could shrink down to that microscopic level immediately. It wasn't gated at
Oh,
all. And so it was only later that I realized that that was just such a nice thing to hold back and use to try to blow people's minds with later, right? Like after you've gotten a little deeper in. And I think it plays a, plus it was also like the game, the other problem I was having, it was just way too overwhelming. The game is
yeah,
already overwhelming to a degree. So it's like, if I, you got to save that and, let people explore one level for a little while first. So that was an odd thing. But in terms of like keeping it fresh, I mean, I'll be honest, there's a lot of just brute force stuff. I had to build a lot of systems. I had like, a lot of content had to be built with Paul's help. There's some tricks like, at the micro scale, the procedural generation uses like a rarity system to
mm,
build. Each of those sort of levels are composed of these atoms, right? And the atoms are classified as like common, uncommon, and rare. Like I almost think of it like magic cards, actually.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so like that, the rare stuff sort of like extends that tail, right? Like long after you've seen all the common and uncommon atoms, you might still stumble into a rare one now and then. There's also some logic that sort of like ensures that, you know, you don't encounter too much stuff too quickly, right? That some
hmm
of the key items and things are like reasonably spaced out, so I don't like spend all of that budget immediately. Um, but yeah, I mean, a lot of it was just, I mean, I knew in some ways like the game is big, but I knew the scope right from the start. I knew you were going to have this microscopic level, and so like I didn't really add to it after that. So I just grinded out until I could fill up everything pretty well, and then I guess it worked in the end.
yeah. So it was from the start. You knew it was going to be two levels. There was never a point where it was just a like one size smaller. It was always going to be, well, let's do at least three.
I think I had a moment where like I almost backed off of like the three and like cut the microscopic level because I just in the context of making UFO 50, I just got a little scared. I'm like, I don't know if I can do this, guys.
Like but it's a huge
Yeah.
expansion of content at every layer.
Yeah. So, I mean, at one point I contemplated cutting it and then, I stuck it out and did it anyways. I think other people on the team encouraged me to keep going.
Yeah. But you never had the hubris to go four. I guess you'd be at like atomic level at that point.
Well, and
You're electron sized.
yeah, I mean, and you mentioned that fake out, which is like you get another potion that shrinks, but it just makes your like sprite half size. So
Yeah.
it does, I guess, play like a joke for people, which is great.
Excellent. All right. I think unless you have something you want to say, I might move on to another game. I know because of course there's 50 games and you worked on many of them.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, no, let's keep going.
Sure. The other one that's come up a bit in the questions is Party House, my personal favorite game. That is, for people who haven't played, a deck building type game. You're building a Rolodex of party guests. They bring cash and popularity, but also sometimes trouble, and too much trouble will shut your party down. So you have a limited number of rounds where you are admitting random guests from your Rolodex to your party. You are hopefully not getting in trouble. You're collecting the rewards, you're spending them on expanding your Rolodex or making your house bigger, and repeat for a limited number of times, and then there'll be a win condition of having certain high cost guests at your party. And a question from Delverino is about the iteration and the balancing, which is something that we also were curious about, because it feels like most of the time you end your round of Party House really close to the last day. Like, it does seem like most of the time, if you manage to win, you just eke it out and it's super close. And just generally, it feels like very tight in that way. So, is that just tons of playtesting and iteration? Is that the board game experience? Like, how did you get it so close like that? It feels like it's very consistent.
Well, I like doing balancing work, so that helps, right? I think if I hated doing it, I wouldn't do so much of it. But I have kind of a three-pronged approach that I use for my board games as well. Because like, balancing is not and it's not an exact science at all. So I just kind of like jump between like three different modes, right? Like, so one is just you play it a ton, you like go with your gut, right? You see what feels good, what feels weak. See like, oh, I always want to buy this one guest, right? Would I still always want to buy them if I made it cost one more? If I made it cost one more, right? So there's a lot of that, and this game was fun for me to play. So that was not hard. But I also did a fair amount of math, like I did some spreadsheeting of like the guests, and assigning values to the resources, things like, popularity and money. Money's worth a little more than popularity, and getting those ratios right and stuff, and fiddling with that. I think you can get lost in that stuff. It gets you close and it helps like identify problem areas, but like you can't solely use that math stuff. But I did use some of it. And then I also like increasingly I do a lot of this like Monte Carlo type simulations. So I remember doing that for this game where, I'd have a very dumb AI that maybe just does a simple expected value calculation to determine, when it should let a guest in versus end the party. And then maybe has one other thing that it does. Actually, like a really simple one of the ones I probably did early on, if I'm remembering correctly, is one that just doesn't buy anything. It just saves
Hmm.
its popularity every turn and then tries to buy, aliens, which are like the main star guests that you need to win this game. And just running that simulation and seeing like, okay, how many days does that take? And if you can win using that strategy, that's bad, right? Like, because that's not fun. I want people to buy stuff, but like, just figuring out like, okay, how many days is that? That's like, your baseline if you have absolutely no strategy. And then I can try something like that again where, maybe I have them buy just one kind of guest, right?
Hmm.
4 copies of one kind of guest, and then see how that changes the number of days. So I'm using these 3 different things and I'm letting them sort of like reinforce and help each other.
That's really interesting, and I guess that's also because John Harris brought up even the resource limits. So it's like you max out at 65 population and 30 cash, which are like really specific numbers, but also seem to feel really good. So is it similar of like arriving at those numbers through kind of ping-ponging between these and figuring out, okay, those are the limits that get you what you're wanting in terms of the day length or the feel.
The 65 is funny, right? Because like I talk to other game designers about this sometimes, where it's like a lot of people like don't like to put those kinds of numbers in their games because it's just like, wouldn't 100 be nicer, But like sometimes the
At
right
least a
number is,
round number, like.
yeah, sometimes the right number is something like 65. I mean, in this case, like the number that I determined through like, testing and balancing was like the cost of the star guests. And that's
Hmm,
what then determined that 65, just
I
for
see.
example. Because the purpose of that's a limit on how much popularity you can have, is to make it like if there was no limit, then you would just never buy the star guest that you need to win until you had all of the popularity you needed to buy 4 at once, because they sort of do clog your Rolodex in this game.
Yeah.
And so that limit is to force you to like maybe you can buy one and then you got to save up for the next one, but it's set so that there are some cheaper guests that you can actually double buy and so on. So it's there. That's why it's such an odd number, I guess.
That's really interesting. And was there ever like a board game version? Did you ever paper prototype it out, or was it something where it was just faster from the start to do it in spreadsheets and kind of digital form?
Yeah, I didn't ever paper prototype this one. Yeah, I haven't really used a lot of paper prototyping for UFO 50. I mean, I think it's a cool thing to do. Um, I might do it on a future project where it's not 50 games. I think with UFO 50, it's just like I gotta just start building it, because if I'm, if I'm not moving, that doesn't feel like there's even time to paper prototype with this kind of project.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. One other thing too, it's kind of about balance. I think balance comes up a lot because it just feels so good in a party house. And another thing John Harris mentioned is that the game itself is like it feels kind of unfair. Like you can have that just the first 3 guests are all trouble, even from the beginning of the game, and there's no defense. You can, of course, then like put other guests in your Rolodex. You do have things like that, but it is completely random. You can just get really unlucky, which does feel like it makes it so that there isn't like a theoretically perfect kind of Rolodex. Like you always have the chance to just get really unlucky and have your, rooms be problems really fast. But at the same time, Jonah's saying that like can't think of a time of ever having a run that feels like it was purely lost because of bad luck. It does always feel like, oh, well, there are some things I could have done. So was that kind of feeling of the unfairness of the way that luck can just get you in a lot of trouble come up? Where did you kind of try and find that line between being able to get really unlucky, but then having enough room for strategy?
So I mean, I really personally, my favorite games are games that are like a lot of luck and a lot of strategy in the same game.
Mm-hmm.
In practice, I don't know if Party House is really any more or less unfair than like other card games with a lot of randomness. I think it's a real gut punch though in Party House, just the way that you experience it, because it's like you get those X's showing up at your party, and it's like very
And then the
painful.
cops, you get the
Yeah.
sirens, and you're like, oh.
Um, but yeah, I mean, you do. I guess this genre, like, it's a deck builder, but this is also a push your luck game, right? And so in
Mm-hmm.
like a push your luck game, where when you bust, essentially you get nothing, is a very punishing thing. So there is like this, like there's a lot of these games in it that exist in tabletop, and they often need to mitigate the luck somehow. And so I am doing that in Party House in a few ways, right? Like one is just like the number of days matters a lot, right? Like there's the 25 days. Um, like randomness just doesn't impact you as like it tends to even out, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
have like enough chances at it, right? If the game was only a week, like 7 days, and you busted one of those times, that's 1/7 of your turns gone, right? So that 25 is being high enough is really important. The troublemakers themselves have, unlike the other guests you start the game with, they have 2 popularity on them. That's also a mitigating factor, right? Because and it kind of makes sense. I don't know, they're trouble, but they're also
Yeah,
pretty fun,
it's
right?
fun.
But like if you have, like the first thing you might draw, this happens sometimes at the beginning of the game, is like 2 troublemakers after, like it's a terrible first draw, or it feels terrible, but you're still getting 4 popularity, which is not bad actually for a first turn. And then the last thing is I have this other final mechanism in the game where you get to, if you do bust, you get to ban somebody.
Yeah.
It's only a temporary ban, because otherwise it would be too powerful, and that part's it's a little awkward maybe, but I think the narrative helps sell it, right? So that means that like you will have one less troublemaker in the next turn. So it makes it actually like a lot less likely that you're going to bust twice in a row, even though it does happen to people, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, I even wonder something I I like. I've come up with this before about if my players are going to be frustrated, I'd like to give them a little guy in the computer to be mad at instead of like the developer, which will then be me. And I think that it's nice. The kicking someone out really redirects. If you're frustrated, it's like it's you, Rockstar. You were the one who ruined my party. I'm going to boot you out. I think that that's actually the framing device of it uh, gives you a bit of an outlet for the emotional response you have to ruining a run.
Yeah, I think that's I mean that's sort of what I was going for, because I think mechanically it's a bit kludgy, but because it has that story and you get to blame somebody, I think it feels a lot better.
That's really cool. I think to grab another question that was in the chat, which is actually a broader one from Gemstones, could you talk a bit about the difference between physical board game design, video game design? What kind of draws you between one or another when it comes to particular projects? Like we talked a bit about how UFO 50 having to go so fast, it's faster to go in the video game realm versus the physical. And I know also that you have a GDC talk that's available online that people should check out. We might drop a link to that where you talk a bit about some of this. But is there anything you want to say about that kind of distinction?
Yeah, I mean real quick, the tabletop games they're definitely more restrictive, I think, in terms of what you can do, right? You got to get people to learn the rules and execute them, right? And people don't act like computers that easily. And you've got to have these physical pieces. There's all these limits that you're operating under. But like I think creative people also understand that like limits can be super freeing, right? And so I think like that also makes it a lot of fun to work on tabletop games because you are kind of like pushing against these constraints all the time. Um, so yeah, I mean, I like both for different reasons. I think that from a high level, I think that's what it's about. It's like how much do I want those creative limitations versus not.
Right, the open-endedness. That makes a lot of sense. One question from Grogbot. I guess, are you familiar? I guess there's fan mods already for UFO 50. Have you seen people making these modifications? And are there any that you're like, oh, that's especially interesting? Or have you been too busy doing game development?
I haven't played any of them. Some of them were showed up on the Cherry Rush
Right.
stream, which was an event that happened recently, like a live weekend long event of people doing cherry runs of all the games. So there were some mods featured in there. So I'm aware of them. I think it's awesome. I really like to see that that's happening. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I try not to like look at it too closely also.
Mm,
Because like I know there's like some party house mods and stuff, but like I guess I don't want to be like influenced by that if I decide to do
mm.
something else with the system or something. So I appreciate it, but kind of from afar.
That makes sense. I think it's also when you are in the like creator to fan position, you can contribute. Like being too close can kind of also create some toxicity that if you start picking out your favorites and kind of engaging too closely, I think you can end up with a popularity contest feeling thing from the fan side versus it being its own community that can, you know, celebrate and be creative versus needing to get like your approval as the creator.
Yeah, I think that's also a very good point.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to also ask a question about Planet Zoldath, which is a more like adventure game. You're navigating a procedurally generated landscape, collecting treasure and various tools, and dealing with hostile aliens. But the interesting thing is that their whole kind of behavior changes each run. So, which ones are hostile, what their attack patterns are, what resource they drop. Like, there's a lot more randomization in Planet Zoldath than in quite a few of the other games. And so, how did you think about the heuristic of like solvability and like preventing soft locks and something that has that degree of, you know, random enemy behavior, random placement, like how do you make sure that each run is still going to work and what does like the testing and iteration look like there?
Well, so it wasn't with this game in particular, it wasn't like a super rigorous process. I mean, this is an early game, like narratively in the collection
Yeah.
of UFO 50, which are these games by this fictional company. This is like a narratively early game. Um, when I was making this game, I was sort of like role playing as if I was a developer who'd like just discovered ProcGen and was like going a little nuts with it. And so I wanted the seeds to be a little wild and unbalanced. You know, I don't mind if like sometimes you get an easy one, sometimes you get a hard one. Obviously, I do want them to be solvable though. So that I mean, to answer that question, the game has like a core system that is stable, which is the item system. That's really the core of the game. There's these like 8 items that always do the same thing. I mean, you don't know where they are, and you can only carry 2 at a time, but that is sort of like the foundation. And then there's a lot of structure built out from that. So um, in some ways, like the game is conceptualized under the hood a little bit like a Metroidvania, in the sense that like there are these like lock and key mechanisms, right? Like you'll encounter like an area that you can't get through, and there is like some item that will get you through it. But in order to make it not feel too like constrained, and also just like as an insurance plan to make sure it's solvable, almost all of those gates you encounter have multiple solutions to get
Hmm.
past them. And so I had thought of it as like there's like they'll have like a primary solution. So there you'll see these crystals in the game that can block your path. And like the primary way to get rid of the crystals is to like find the nail gun and break them. Uh, but you can also like there's like also a weirder path that you can take that's like a 2-step path that requires having 2 items, right? Where you can use the metamorpher to like change the crystals into something else, and then you can safely detonate them with a bomb. So I try to put in like all of these secondary ways through the gates that required a little more effort or cleverness. Um, and that was one of the ways I tried to ensure that like it was still solvable.
Right.
Um, that and there was just a lot of logic and structure under the surface, like determining that like how all of those like gates and keys are set up, right?
Right. Right. So maybe something like layered of putting some gates down before putting the keys down or things like that.
Uh, yeah. So like, there's always Um, so there's like one like the goal of the game from like a high level is like to find these like three map pieces, right?
Hmm.
So, but they're always like the game really is pretty structured, right? So like one map piece is always in the dungeon. The dungeon is always behind like there's always at least two gates within the dungeon, right? And then the dungeon itself is always like behind like yet another gate. And so then I have to find those keys, place them, but then also have to make sure that I'm not putting them inside the dungeon, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the main thing. You don't want to lock the keys in the car, so to speak,
Right.
right?
That makes a lot of sense. And I like, you mentioned too that there's a framing mechanism for the entire collection about this fictional game development company and watching them as developers kind of grow and go through the highs and lows of game development. And I like how that's come up and come up too with the framing of Party House of how that really impacts people's reaction. Like I think that it's really, yeah, I think it must have been a lot of fun to be able to, as someone who's been a designer for longer, go back and like role play someone discovering ProcGen for the first time, and that's a fun framing device that then gives you a lot of freedom of like, well, maybe the consistency of the runs isn't as polished as you might expect, but that's okay because the point is that you're seeing someone for the first time getting to throw a bunch of randomness in there and see what shakes out, and like almost the point is for it to feel a little bit rougher.
Yeah, I mean that was a fun aspect of the project. I mean, I think Zoldath is the main game where I did that pretty consciously. Um of like actually sort of like imagining I was the developer. But yeah, I mean that was, always looking for those connections like between the games and between the games and the meta story and all of that.
Yeah, and do you think that, I guess I'm just curious, going through that process of making so many games with that small team over what I think 9 years, like how do you think that's influenced you kind of as a developer going forward of getting to have the ability to switch between all these different genres and yeah, like personifying this whole like a fictional developer and all within this context? Like it is different than making that amount of games discreetly in the same amount of time, this like cohesion of it. Is that something that you think has given you a different kind of angle or something as a takeaway that feels unique to this style of collection versus making discrete however many games in 9 years? I don't remember, 13, however many you were kind of lead designer on.
Uh I
Who
forget. Yeah,
knows?
it depends how you
A big
uh
number.
yeah, I mean it's about a third of the collection, however you count, but also like I mean everything's so collaborative, it's kind of hard
Yeah.
to say. But yeah, I mean, well, for one thing, you learn a lot if you do this, right? Like, I don't know that I recommend it, but obviously, spending 9 years making all these different genres, including genres that I was not, you know, maybe don't come as naturally to me, right? Because I didn't want to repeat myself. So, I mean, there's a fair amount of board gamey strategy things in here, but I stretched myself and did other stuff too, and like getting to do that, you learn a lot. Um, I think the challenge going forward is like, how do I take the good parts of this, right, which is that it was very freeing in some ways, right? Because we have this framing context that's very freeing, like we just talked about, because no single game has to carry the whole thing, right? So you can be a little more experimental. You can make some odder choices. Like, how can I sort of take that fun of just that comes with that, right? Of just being able to experiment so much and like take that into a future project. I'm not sure how to do that yet, but I guess I'll find out.
Yeah. There's one other hyper specific question. If you don't remember it or if it wasn't your design decision, then that's okay. But Adam Dolan asks about Lords of Disconia and how the game picks which units get to move in a particular turn and how that particular design element was decided on. Do you remember?
Yeah, there's a simple queue system. So like if I think you 8 units is the max. By default, you can only pick from 3. The
Mm.
original order is just straight up random. I mean, I toyed with other methods, but it's like I don't know. You got to really pick your battles when you're making like a 2-button controller strategy game, right? In terms of like,
Yeah,
where you're going to like give the player extra decisions. So it's just like a random order of your units. Um, and you get to pick from the first 3 at the front of the queue, and then the one you pick goes to the back of the line, basically.
right. That's funny. It reminds me of learning that in Slay the Spire, the enemy AI choices are completely prescriptive every time, a detail I had never noticed in 200 hours of playing Slay the Spire. Um, but yeah, sometimes the simpler solution is perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, I think it was suggested maybe on the Eggplant podcast that the order could have been determined by like the order you've bought them in.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you got to be careful with stuff like that because now it's like, okay, when I'm buying things, I've got to keep them in the back of my mind, like if I'm buying them in the right optimal order. So, sometimes random is just the best way to like allow the player to relax, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, taking the
um,
decision out of their hands entirely.
yeah. Whereas like Slay the Spire, I think is making it sounds like I actually didn't know that either. To be honest,
Right.
has taken the opposite like decision, right? Like they've made it like very predictable so that players can think about it more if they want.
Yeah, and I think that the really high level players do. But most people don't, even game designers. I hope that that's fact right. I'm like 90% sure that that's true. Yeah, I think that that's really cool. And I think, too, again, with the framing of like when you have a collection of 50 games, people are probably coming into it more wanting to play a game for a little while, get the sense of it, and then play something else versus if they just bought the one game and they're going to go deep. So I think it makes a lot of sense to be really aware of how much you're asking of them to be able to really engage with one of those games in those collection. Even though I know they're not mini games, they are all meant to be a game unto themselves.
I think that makes sense. Although, I mean, we were pretty maximalist, I would say. Like with this, I mean, it's not my
Lost in
philosophy
the sauce.
with like, but intentionally so, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like when I make a board game, usually I am trying to like really manage the player's cognitive load and so on. And there is an element to UFO 50 where like we talked openly about we're going to overwhelm people, and that's part of the point. Yeah.
Well, that's delightful. All right. Well, we are coming up now on time, but this has been really great. Thank you for taking the time to come answer some specific questions and talk a bit about it. UFO 50 is really, I think, a unique and notable kind of accomplishment. And I, again, recommend people check out your GDC talk. It's really interesting. More stuff about board game design and video game design. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to see more of what this conference has in store.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess if you're able to hang around in the social space, then at the end of everything, people can chat. But if not, then it's still been great to have you.
It's been great to be here. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.